Are you ready to manage your work and personal world better to live a more fulfilling, productive life? Then you've come to the right place. Welcome to ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity. Here are your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.
Welcome back, everybody, to ProductivityCast, episode 10. I wish I had a kazoo. It's the birthday 10th episode of ProductivityCast. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm joined with Augusto Pinaud, my co-host, as well as Francis Wade and Art Gelwicks. So we are all together here today for this episode. Let's get into it. Today, we are going to mostly fight in good faith and good effort about smartphone productivity and in essence what the best smartphone is out there to be most productive. And I thought that what we would cover today was really the essence of how we use our phones to be productive, and in the vein of the mobile productivity topics that we have had over the last several episodes, I want us to talk about the pros and cons of the various, not only hardware, but software that we use for our smartphones. So I think it's probably best for us to go around and say what our primary smartphone is that we're using today, and then we'll get into it. So I'll start. I am currently using a Google Nexus 5X as my primary phone, and I am running Android Nougat, which is 7.x. So the latest version of I think it's 7.1 point something. So that's what I'm doing.
Well, apparently it was established before this call started recording that you have a dumb phone, and my dumb phone is running 10x, and it's an iPhone 6 Plus.
So you have the 6 Plus.
I'm running an LG G4 Android that's running Android 6, I want to say 601 right now. That's the current version, and the Nova launcher. And for Android, you got to name the launcher if you're running Android, because that's part of the fun of what makes it productive.
Okay, well then I'll say I'm running the Google launcher because it's a Google Nexus 5X, and so I stick with pure Android. I'm a
purist, huh?
Yeah, I'm a pure Android guy. I really love the interface.
I'm using Alcatel. I don't know the model number, but it's running Android 6.
Great. So we can all gang up on Augusto. Actually, this is probably a pretty good percentage of the number of Android users versus the number of iPhone users globally. So tall order, Augusto.
Notice that in order for them to feel that they have any chance to beat us, they needed to come 3-1. Okay, start with the conversation.
Oh, Augusto, you just brought the pain. The pain.
You know, apples bruise easily, right? So it's gonna have to be nice.
Yeah, that is true. The number of iPhones that I have, the screens that I've cracked, is far beyond the number that I have cracked of other phones. So
you know what though, this whole glass-backed phone trend actually I think has caused a lot of issue with that. I know a guy who's managed to break multiple Samsungs that have the glass back. I think he's got the 7. I don't know that I would chalk that up as a negative to one side or the other. I think both of them have bouncing issues. They don't handle impacts well.
I may need to agree with that. On the race to make the phone look prettier, we had been sacrificed durability in a massive extent. I don't recall, and I'm sure they did, but I don't recall on the old phones, so pre-iPhone era, that you break your screen that often. I don't remember anybody really breaking their screen on their old phones, and they were pretty much indestructible. I mean, I think my Palm Pilot, and I broke one screen of a Palm Pilot as far as I remember. Never broke on the Trio, but even before that, when I had the StarTech, I think those things were simply indestructible.
Yeah, I don't know how I could destroy one of those LCD screens on one of my handspring Palm Pilots way back when, but the handspring, I mean, like, I threw that thing all over the place. It bounced, it slid, it got crunched in my truck door several times, in a coat pocket, and the thing kept on ticking. With the iPhone, I felt as though I was carrying around this dainty little thing that every time I went outside, there was a potential for me to have a loved one die. It was a nick of the screen. It was a death knell, and so unfortunately, because of that, I ended up going to very strong cases. That meant that, for all intents and purposes, I no longer had an iPhone. I had this giant brick in my pocket because I was always concerned about damaging it. But let's veer back on topic, which is the productivity of a smartphone. What are the foundations here that we want to really cover in terms of the things that make a smartphone productive, and then we can have a better sort of comparison or compare and contrast as it relates to the various products on the market.
And I think in order to have that discussion, we may need to come close to an agreement that on the smartphone race, there are kind of three really well-defined eras. You have the pre-iPhone, where you had the Palm Pilots and the BlackBerry race, that they really were competing completely different ways, but they were the origin of this smartphone race. And then you have a moment, and to be honest with you, I don't know exactly what is the year where that happened, when Android really became to be a complete solution, because the first Android phones were not really competing against anything that was there productivity-wise. It was a beginning. It was, they may have competed with Windows phones, but they were not really a productivity powerhouse. That came much later, and I don't know on what version of Android, to be honest with you, that changed from being to be, a really option for productivity. Even on the iPhone, the first iPhone was not an option for productivity. I think it was the third version, the 3GS, where you first have the option. No, the 3GS, the 4, I think it was the first option where their phone really could be now a productivity device, where you could now have enough third-party apps to really be able to get productive. And I like to say it was after that where Android really got powerful. And today we are in a race that is really more about what you like and what you prefer than really a matter of if the iPhone is more productive or the Android is more productive. I think today you can do a lot with both devices. It comes more, in my opinion, to a compatibility issue than really a power issue. The things that you have a lot more rope, in my opinion, on an Android phone to hang yourself than what you have on an iPhone. Apple is a more closed system. There is a lot less things that you are allowed to do and to play with, at least not without some kind of knowledge. That Android instead leaves that door open. That is great for the people who know what they're going to do and what they do and how to do it. But I don't know if it's that great to the people who don't have that level of knowledge. And I think that's where the iPhone, for that non-tech user, it's a much better option than the Android per se. And given in this conversation today, we are for technologically savvy people, so that the discussion goes to a different level. But when you talk to people that are not and don't care, and really all that they want is that the phone do a couple of things, I believe that the iPhone, as a productivity device, wins hands down to the Android, mostly because the user who has not enough technical knowledge cannot hang themselves.
I would say, as a follow-up to your earlier statement, Augusto, I think KitKat, Android 4.0 was where I felt as though the Android platform had graduated from being what it was to what it is today in terms of its just overall cohesiveness in terms of its use. Really, Android 6.0 is where I became very comfortable with it having the same interface parity in terms of cleanliness and use that the iPhone did or iOS did at the time. And I think that's true. I think that Android was slower to get that same cleanliness of interface and ease of use back there. So what I heard you say, and some of the thoughts that I had about this, were customization, the selection of productivity apps in the app stores across all of the ecosystems, whether that be even the Microsoft App Store, Android, Google Play App Store. If you're running a Kindle Fire phone still, I know I think they discontinued those. The Apple App Store, so on and so forth. So across all of these various app stores, productivity app selection, ease of use and sort of its intuitiveness, I think are important. Form factor and customer and technical support, because I think that something that we frequently don't think about when we're choosing a smartphone is that if it goes down, how are we going to get it back up and running as quickly as possible so we can get back to getting things done?
And that is correct. We are lucky in this call that we have, again, people that is technically savvy. But for example, we have the interesting challenge that I know Francis has for people living in the U.S. It's simple. The phone die and, well, maybe costly, but you can walk into a store and solve the problem 45 minutes later. Okay, when you live outside of the U.S., well, that game change. That's a fact. And again, for technical people, it doesn't matter. You give me a computer and I will fix my phone. If it will take me more or less time, that's a different discussion, but I will. But when I think, for example, my parents, who, given they have their own personal tech support, but when you think of my parents, they don't have the knowledge to fix their phone. Doesn't matter what tools you throw at them. They need to be able to walk into some kind of establishment where they are basically going to hand their phone to a technician and he's going to tell them how to fix it, because they don't know. And I wish to tell you that my parents are the exception of the rule, but I think it's exactly the opposite. We are the exception of that rule.
I have to agree with you 100% on that, Augusto. I mean, we are not what should be considered the standard measure for productivity and usability on these devices, because honestly, we're that 1% of the 10% of the early adopters when it comes to these kinds of technologies. It's interesting thinking about some of the things that you've said so far have made me keep going back to, okay, what has made the smartphone as a device cross that threshold to wind up in everybody's pocket? Because like a lot of us, I had Palm Pilots, I had Samsung Blackjack 2s, I had all of the Scion 3As, all the different productivity tools over the years. And while I thought all of those were really superior tools at the time, they never caught on. They never really made that impact level. So I was trying to figure out what caused that threshold and what made these truly productive. And I think we saw the shift when we saw two things really take hold. One was messaging, when we realized that the connectivity between the phones beyond just text messaging, but getting into things like on the iPhone, iMessage, getting into WhatsApp and the various other messaging clients, that took us to another level of productivity because it helped us expand that network effect between the devices. I mean, personal productivity, if we stay isolated, we literally are not much better off than what we had with the Palm Pilots. But if we are connected to each other, then our productivity goes up by an order of magnitude. So I think messaging is one of the things that caused that leap forward. But I think the second thing really doesn't have anything to do with productivity, but it has to do with engagement. And before I came on the call, I was thinking, what makes the best smartphone? And I realized that the best smartphone is the one that you use all the time, the one you are constantly engaged with and able to take advantage of. And I think the second thing that pushed the smartphones into that area are the cameras and imaging. Because if we take that piece of the equation away, The smartphones really aren't all that smart. I mean, they're doing basic things, but when we start to introduce improved imagery into it, not only just with the camera, but also the display of the images themselves, that's what's become the compelling design piece. And it's also become the compelling factor in most of the productivity applications we look at. I mean, when people look at the newest iPhone, they're looking at what's the best, what's its screen quality, what's its resolution, what type of screen is it from a technical standpoint. But from a user standpoint, they're looking at going, does this look good? Because if it looks horrible, I'm not going to use it. And many apps, while they may be excellent apps, languish on the vine because of poor visual design. So when we start to say which is the best phone, and I'll make a confession right now, many, many, many moons ago, I had an iPhone, I had a 3GS, and I had a 4. So don't hold it against me. But but I think you bring up an excellent point. I always compare the Apple and the Android experience to, do you want it to just work, or do you want it to be able to be what you exactly want it to be? And if that's your deciding factor, it's pretty clear. You're going to go Apple or Android. But even that sounds funny. You hear what I'm comparing there? I'm comparing Apple, which is a hardware and software choice, to Android, which is a software choice, not a hardware choice. You've got that variety of open platforms within Android. So when we think about it from a productivity standpoint, my personal opinion is that I think Android gives you more range of options if you're looking for something to really fit your methodology. If you want something that's just going to work right out of the box and you don't have to think about it and it just executes, Apple's a great way to go. If you want to be able to tinker and tune and make it fit exactly what you're doing, Android may be a better option. But for the physical device, you're just going to have to go and try them out.
Something that I always try to think about in terms of smartphones is that I think you touched on a very, very important point here, Art, which is that there's usually one, maybe two flavors of iOS that are running on phones today. I think at time of recording, we're talking about 76 to 80% of iPhones are now on iOS 10. When you talk about Android, you're talking about hundreds of different models of mobile devices, not just phones, right? You're talking about the Nexus player, which is the Apple TV equivalent. You're talking about various products that have Android running on them. And then you're talking about 4 to 5 to sometimes even more than that versions of Android across those devices. So as probably I bet you there's somebody out there running Android 2.0 on some device today, all the way up to where we are now, which is 7, with the bulk majority of Android devices running, I think, for somewhere around the 4 range. Maybe it's 5 now. With that type of fragmentation, this is not Google's fault with regard to Android OS having this fragmentation. It is the variety. It's the ability that you can choose the device and the software comes with it, versus Apple that chooses the form factor for you. It chooses the operating system that you get to use, and it enforces an upgrade schedule that you don't have any control over.
Is it really the operating system that makes any difference? And this is where I keep jumping back to it in my head.
I don't think so anymore.
We're not productive with the operating system. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at my phone sitting next to my Chromebook, which I'm using for the call. Everything, 90% of what I do through my Chromebook, because I can do 90% of what I need to do through my Chromebook. But I can also go and do the exact same things if I go sit on my Windows 10 machine. It's not the operating system that's making me productive. It's the applications that sit on top of it and the availability of those applications. So if somebody asks, which is the better phone to make me, a better business person, it's the one that has the apps available to it that you actually need. If we look at the most basic set of features, take any phone right out of the box. There's basic productivity apps there anyway. every one of them has them. They've got a calendar, they've got a notepad, they've got a contact list, they've got messaging. All phones are basically the same, whether you pay $900 for them or $50. It's where we go beyond that basic level. And I look at the smartphones now having reached the same level as laptops are currently. Laptops are pretty much interchangeable. I mean, you can get, higher end ones to do specific things, but for the most part, they all basically do the same job. You pick one because not so much because it has the best specs, because it's the latest and greatest. You may pick one because it's lightest and you want a light one, or it has a nice screen because you like the nice display. You're going to find one that fits your hardware requirements just based on how you are as a person. A lot of people like the Apple design aesthetic. I'll be honest with you, the Chromebook I'm looking at looks just like a MacBook Air. Why? Because it's a great design aesthetic. So again, when we think about these kinds of recommendations to people, what's the phone I should get? Get the one you can afford, you're going to use, and figure out what you might be using it for in advance, and just make sure it can do that. That being said, buy an Android.
And I think, Art, that's the third element on what you were saying, and I agree with you on what you're saying. That the smartphone, what changed with the smartphone, as you said, was the ability to message. I've been doing business with people outside of the United States for many years, and it was a time where not only was difficult, it was expensive. They tried to get the best communication method kind of was Skype before Microsoft bought it, and it was difficult to communicate. I remember when WhatsApp came in, actually even before, when the BlackBerry had the BlackBerry Messenger, that it was a closed system, but you could talk to any BlackBerry user in any part of the world. And
I loved BlackBerry Messenger.
It was really solid. And I went and bought a BlackBerry just to be able to use BlackBerry Messenger. My main machine was a Trio, but the BlackBerry Messenger allowed me to do better business much, much faster than what my Trio allowed me at the time. And I carried both for a time until WhatsApp came into the game and basically wiped everybody's out, including Apple Messenger. Apple iMessage worked great if you know the other guys using iMessage. Otherwise, if you know the guys outside of the States, you go WhatsApp. And most people to this day have them both. But the third element, and I think is the element that really changed the game on the smartphones, was the apps. When I remember when I wrote or co-wrote iPad Only book, that was one of the things that was quite interesting for me, was how much what we used to call at the time the appification of the work. Because it doesn't matter really if you are Android or you are iOS. The reality is there is a moment, okay, and it's a moment around 2009 where developers understood that the game of software could be changed forever. Okay, up to that moment, basically software was big, expensive, and only work on certain devices, period. And around 2009, Android as well as iOS started introducing smaller apps that could be even more efficient than what you could find on your PC and your Mac. If you go before that time, your first criteria to move a laptop, as you said, okay, was, will this run fill in the blank, whatever it was, okay? Before even you considering the discussion if you needed a Windows machine or you needed a Macintosh, the first question was, what's my key software? If you live on Outlook, forget about it. The Mac wasn't an option until around 2009. In 2007, if you live on an Exchange environment, yeah, if you were geeky and tech enough, you will be able to make it work. But again, that's 1% of the 10%. For the rest of the world, it was like, nope, we need to run Microsoft Office because that's the only thing that works with Exchange. That was a fact. Even to this day, there is a lot of people who tell you, well, the only way to write a letter is to use Microsoft Word. Well, not anymore. It's been not like that for many years now. But that was a reality And what changed with the little apps or with the apps was that now we give access or universal access to software to the people. If Microsoft Office, for an example, was $300 or $400. Not everybody can go and buy a $1,200, $1,500 computer that was around what it was at that time, and then add another $1,000 in software just to make work. It wasn't a possibility. Now with the iPhone or with the phones and the apps in general, you could go, and as you said, you could go for the $900 phone, or you can go for the heavy subsidized $50 phone, add $30 more in software, and you have technically the same capabilities for basic work that you had for $2,000 a year prior. And that, I think, is what makes the change happen. One of the biggest challenge most companies I consult and I work with 2017 have is that their directors of the companies and the ones who are fixing the strategy has not discovered yet that they think, oh, well, people is coming to us in computers. No, your massive amount of people who will visit you and will check you out is going to check you in a smartphone, not on a tablet, not on a computer, on a smartphone. As the apps were to make tablets really powerful and will have made tablets really powerful at the same time was exactly what killed the tablet as a form factor. Because when you put those same apps on the phone, what you did was you create on your pocket something that was more powerful than anything before. My first iPhone with apps, that it was the second version, so the the iPhone 3. Okay, that phone power-wise was way more powerful than my current corporate laptop at that time. Okay, given it was I got what I got, and I'm not going to define it in words because otherwise we will need to mark this show as explicit. But but the reality is my iPhone was more powerful than that Dell computer, and it cost a lot less.
I think you're absolutely right. The one thing we're missing here is that when the iPhones really hit the marketplace and got people to start thinking about this in a different manner, they changed the game by raising the ceiling as to what you could do on a pocket-sized device. Up until that point, everything was, I can calendar, to-do list, that happy stuff. But now more and more and more capability. I was just thinking that one of the things I use most often on my phone is not something that's on my phone. It's the Bluetooth keyboard I have that I attach to my phone to make my phone a mini laptop.
If you think about it, the feature you use the least on your smartphone is the phone capability. At least that's what happened to me.
I can make calls with this thing? That's so cool!
I've noticed that the way I use my smartphone has changed over time. And first it was unconscious, but now it's become more conscious. And I think what I've tried to do is to think, okay, I carry this device with me everywhere. It's the only device that goes with me. It's the only one that's subject to the elements. So it's likely to get wet, it's likely to get hot, it's likely to fall, it's likely to end up in my pocket or get banged by the door of my car, you guys said. So it's the one that's closest to my body, and it's the only one that has my attention all the time. So when I started over there and then worked my way back, I asked myself, okay, in terms of my being productive, what functions does this device need to provide me 24 hours a day or at different points of the day that the others can't provide or won't provide, or they're not portable? So I kind of asked myself, it's a bit of a Star Trek question, because I think Star Trek, they had a device that they carried with them all the time, right? I think it was, I forget the name of it, but
it was actually called
a pad.
I'm going to show my geek cred. It was called a PAD, P-A-D-D.
A pad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was a personal something digital device. So.
Right, although they always did have their communicators, on them at the same time. So
right, and that's why we always liked the Palm Pilots, because they flipped open the same way. I'm just saying.
I remember that. I had a flip.
And anybody who had a flip phone or a Palm Pilot at some point flipped it open and wished it made that little chirp sound. I'm just saying.
Oh yeah. Oh, come on, the tricorder was like the thing, you know what I mean? But so that's actually 3 devices, right? Because you had your communicator on you, which is always on your chest, and you could always communicate with the ship. Then you had your tricorder that flipped open, and you could do whatever it did. And then they had the pad. So they had a lot of mobile devices, and a lot of it communicated. So it's.
But that's what I started to do. So I started by thinking, okay, if I had the one device that I carry with me at all times, it's the only device that's ubiquitously near to my body. What functions should it perform? And I started with the basic, which is of course a phone. Okay, so it needs to answer voice messages from other people, so that I have a choice about being interrupted with respect to what I'm doing at the current moment. So it needs to be a great interrupter with voice messages. Okay, how about WhatsApp messages? Okay, I said it needs to accept WhatsApp messages, but not interrupt me as loudly or as urgently, because I'm not going to stop what I'm doing to pick up a WhatsApp message under normal circumstances. Okay, so it's an interruption messaging device that reaches me 24/7. Okay, that's good. It's also a portal to the cloud. So everything I have that's important should not be lost on my laptop. It should be in the cloud so that I can get to it from wherever I am 24/7 in the case of an emergency. I said, okay, so it needs to be a cloud portal, a sort of a doorway to the data that I critically need whenever I need it. So nothing gets trapped anywhere in my ecosystem. It should be a nice doorway. And the last thing I think I came up with was that, okay, it needs to guide me in my daily activity. So it needs to present me with a set of notifications and alarms that keep me on track. So not phone calls, not WhatsApp messages, but preset reminders to do certain activities so that it interrupts me with enough force so that I can start the activity, because doing that particular activity is important. It needs to differentiate between important activities and non-important activities. So just making a random phone call is not important, but jumping on a teleconference is really important. So it needs to remind me with enough force that I have a teleconference coming up and not allow me to ignore the message. It shouldn't be quiet. It needs to be loud and haptic. So it needs to be a great interruptive device so that it keeps me on track with respect to my daily behaviors. So the fourth one is the one I think is the weakest, incidentally. But when I put them together, this device that walks with me can help me to be productive, because it, at least in the 4 areas that I mentioned, those are the 4 that I've thought of, it does those 4 things really well as the sort of basic package. Everything else is optional, or just a matter of convenience, or nice to have but not necessary. So what I found myself doing over time is getting rid of the non-essential stuff and trying to boost the presence of the 4 essentials and the role they play. It's not easy because the software isn't really designed to play that role, but that's what I found myself doing. With respect to productivity, it kind of comes down to, so far, 4 functions, but I'm open to adding other functions, but I'm not going to add a whole lot more. And certainly things like gaming, they don't enter into the critical 4. I don't know what you guys think, but that's what I've come up with respect to my smartphone use.
Yeah, I think you're talking about something very in terms of essential. I think that's very, very close to what I would probably look at it as. I'm probably a little bit more. No, not probably. I am way more geeky in the sense that I'm a member of the Quantified Self movement. So I'm tracking a lot of data. So I need to make sure that my phone connects to the other devices that are tracking passively data, as well as being able to actively communicate with the phone, which is sort of the hub of all of this data being pushed through it. So in my case, I have a Huawei watch with Android Wear 2.0 on it right now, and I have several applications that are taking heart rate information. It's taking my movements and walking distances and all of that, and it's calculating based on that, what I'm doing, how much I'm using my phone, how much screen time I have. And this helps with that notification component that you were talking about, Francis, of being able to give feedback in as tight a loop as possible so that I'm able to understand, oh, you know what? Something's trending here throughout my day that I shouldn't or should be doing more of, right? And that's really, really helpful for me. I like you, think that the notification functionality on phones is probably its weakest, and I wish my phone had like a glove, boxing glove that could come out of it and just, bop me in the face to let me know when these really important notifications were available, and then I could go run off to that thing that needs to be done. But until I get a boxing glove attachment.
I think companies are missing an opportunity to use smartphones to do exactly what you said, which is to gather data that gives us feedback. I wouldn't say I'm a geeky quantified self-aware. I'm more of an observer. And I try to quantify whatever I can, but the apps just aren't there to quantify the things I want to quantify. And far less, forget about giving feedback. They just aren't there to even gather the data initially or in the first instance. If they were there, I would use them, because the fact is this device walks with me 24/7. So the opportunity is there, but the software companies and I guess our imagination just hasn't kept up. We're completely lagging in terms of the apps that we could put on a smartphone with respect to quantifying our behavior compared to what we have.
I think there are a couple of applications that are really starting to make some really great inroads there. One that I've been using recently is called Instant. And if you go to either of the app stores, you can find it. It's called Instant, and Android as well as iOS. And it's been the closest to a passive collector of important data. It currently tracks, I believe, screen time, how much time you actually are looking at the screens, how much you're moving, so movement, and sleep, and then the applications that you're using on the phone itself. And I don't believe that the sleep is accurate. I think that, at least from all of the quantified selfers that I've spoken with, you really do need to have multiple metrics to be able to identify if you're awake or asleep. And the primary indicator of sleep is heart rate monitoring, and that requires a good heart rate monitor, which most people are not going to go out and buy. But the point of that is that the applications are starting to graduate there, but aren't really there yet. And so, I agree with you in part, Francis. I've really liked Instant and the data that it's been able to give back to me. I think also it's important for us to recognize that the app ecosystem is starting to gain sort of equalization in terms of people developing for Android and iOS. As the technologies start to blend together, it's easier and easier now to port applications from one platform to another, at least for the solid applications that you're going to be using cross-platform. But choosing the smartphone to be most productive, for me, ended up choosing the central platform of my professional and personal world, which ended up being Google. And so it was a natural choice when I had an iPhone to get a MacBook, to get other Apple devices that connected to one another. But as I started to use those devices, I recognized that I was really just using Google products on, Google services on top of this hardware, and at some point I had replaced everything on my iPhone with something that was Google. And so I just recognized that at that point, my phone needed to be as close to the Google system as possible. And what better system than the application, the operating system built by Google. Android was a natural choice for me, and now what I see myself doing is being more strategic in terms of the applications that I put on my smartphone. So I think for being most productive, especially when it comes to size limitations on the phones, right? Because your phones might have 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes of space. Obviously they come with much larger spaces than that, storage than that. But really, realistically, most people have smaller space limitations, and I try to keep the amount of of storage used up on the phone to about half the size of the phone itself, right? Because I feel like that's a good sort of place for the phone to be. And in order to do that, I've had to choose what are the applications that I really need on this phone when I'm away from another computing device, and then what are the things that I want the phone to do when I am near my other computing devices. And what I've learned is that I really only want my phone to be a phone when I'm near other computing devices, because I like keyboards. I just really like the idea of being able to sit down at a keyboard and to touch type. And otherwise, the phone is just not the screen that I want to be pecking at when I have a full 15-inch screen in front of me and a keyboard. I mean, just the comparison is not there. The functionality is, I've pretty much functionality parity from the desktop to the mobile, but I really just like the larger real estate of screen space as well as typing space. So I do like that ability to say, okay, well, I'm turning off all of these applications on the phone and I'm not installing these applications on the smartphone because I don't want to do that work there. It's tangential, but it's sort of the corollary to Augusto's concept of not having email on your phone, and only using email on your iPad. It's just not where you do that. And I've found that to be the case with my smartphone, is saying, okay, these are functions. Like, I don't have Skype on my smartphone currently because I just don't video chat on my phone. It's always bad. It's always a bad experience. I don't like the way in which Skype works on it, and I think it's invasive to an extent. So I've chosen not to have it on there. And I have all kinds of messaging and all kinds of other video apps on my phone, but I just don't do it there. I only do it from my tablet or my laptop with my webcam on, and it works for me. And I think that makes me far more productive when I can say, oh, you know what? I'm on my phone, can't Skype right now. And just making that clear-cut rubric for myself that that's not what's going to happen. I want to talk a little bit about customer support and tech support and how we all access it.
Oh, and I think that's, when you go now to the tech support, and I think that sadly where, at least to my knowledge, iPhone and Apple per se, wins hands down. Because again, if you go to the non-techie people, okay, that at the end of the day is a majority, for that tech support, nothing beats, at least in the United States, to walk into an Apple store and get your problem solved. And to my knowledge, there is no other place you can walk to get that kind of solution to your problems if you are not technically inclined.
I have to agree with you on that. I mean, it's one of the things, and this is again that US-centric model. Here on the Android side, if you want support, you're going to have to go to your carrier to get it, because most Android phones come through a carrier contract or carrier relationship. And honestly, try as they might, they will never reach the same level of comfort and competence with all the different models of Android phone they have versus a company that is centric on one platform, one operating system, one hardware configuration. So yeah, I'll give you that one, Augusto. Apple wins that one.
Tech support, what's that? Leave it at
that. And that, you know what? It's funny. It's a joke. It's a joke, but it's true. That's what makes it so funny, is that Android, you really have to be self-supporting or know a friendly geek. Because if you don't, you're really stuck in many cases. Apple, there's always the Apple Store. But Android, heaven help you if you have to get somebody on the phone.
The only device that I know currently that gets high-level customer support on the Android platform is the Pixel devices. Google does have very, very strong support for the Pixels, and for the price point, I believe that's why Google is providing that kind of support. For those of you who are on Android and are ever curious about that, just go to support.google.com/Android, and you will go ahead and do that. So the Android Help Center is where you get all of the assistance for not only Android specifically, but Android connected to, say, Samsung or LG, Motorola, Nexus, and or your Pixel device. But Pixel does give you a higher level of support where you can do that. In-store support is, for those folks who want to walk in and speak to someone face to face, I'm guessing there are the Best Buys of the world and other kinds of technology retailers, electronics retailers that you can go to. But those are fewer and further between today, I feel, than at one point. I think that the Apple wins in sort of having a cohesive system, and it's really nice. It's a good experience. At least I've found it to be a good experience, even when the technicians don't know specifically the issue that I'm dealing with. My reasons for going into an Apple store with and making a Genius Bar appointment tend to be much more complicated issues than your average. This doodad isn't working. It's much more specific issues. And so I tend to have a different experience than the average consumer, but I think it's really a cohesive system. I mean, the ability to go on your phone or on the laptop and schedule an appointment and just show up, sit down, and have someone help you with your computer or smartphone or mobile tablet or your iPad in that case is really, really helpful. Final thoughts on the best smartphone for productivity?
I'll give my counter to it. I don't think it's a matter of brand or OS any longer. I think it's a matter of functionality, and I think the functionality is going to appear on all devices at probably about the same time, because developers are developing for all platforms right now at the same time. So I think the differences are going to go away. I think it's going to be a matter of innovative design that matches the behaviors that users are trying to implement.
For me, I really do believe that the application ecosystems today have reached a critical point where smartphones can be as productive as the other devices, whether they be desktop or mobile tablet, depending upon your comfort level with interacting and engaging with a smaller screen and a microphone. And so if you're comfortable with the input-output of a small screen for the type of work that you do, then the smartphone will do it. So that's not my primary concern. I think, price point is sort of king here in terms of how much phone for the money can you get? What's the best value for you? And secondarily, where are you going to be using this device, right? Because context is important. And so where and how you're going to be using that device is going to be really important for you. And as the world moves forward, as the world turns, so to speak, we're going to see more Android users. We already have more Android users on the planet. And the reality is that those users are going to be working for businesses. And as more businesses use Android, that's going to change the terms of how smartphones are used. So I really do think that things are going to become much more Android-centric, or at least whatever Google is putting on phones when it comes to a free operating system that you can put on many different devices. And so from that sort of democratic perspective, as you democratize the operating system, you create a different set of parameters for how people get work done. And Android is leading that role right now, while Apple and iOS did at one time. I believe that Android is now making those choices because it's so connected to Google applications and so on and so forth. And I think we all need to take that into account as we look at how productive we're going to be with our smartphones.
I need to agree with you, and I think as the IT generations continue to evolve and the new generations get into those high on the food chain IT decisions, we are going to see how a lot of those corporate numbers change from Microsoft to Chromebooks. As Art was saying, he can do 90% of what he do on a Chromebook, and it's the same experience I have seen on the iPad for many years, and that I have seen many people. And the reality is, I think, in the next 5 years, we are going to see more and more organizations away from their traditional Windows system and more into a Chromebook base, because cost-wise, for the organization, it doesn't make sense to do anything else.
I'll play the diplomatic one. There isn't a winner in this anymore. Used to be you could make an argument one for the other and probably win the argument. I think the consensus that I'm hearing so far is that it's really moved beyond the device. The device is truly the personal choice of form factor and function. It's what do you need to be able to do anywhere at any time and have with you all the time, and thinking about those decisions and then choosing something that's going to fit.
That ends this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things personal productivity. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, and I'm here with Augusto Pinaud, Francis Wade, and Art Gelwicks. Thank you guys for joining me here on this episode.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and stay productive, everybody.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of ProductivityCast, the weekly show about all things productivity, with your hosts, Ray Sidney Smith and Augusto Pinaud.